For years, the RSPCA has been campaigning to have whips banned from horse racing. Now, the animal rights group says it has evidence that jockeys are not following the rules. A major study of slow-motion footage found horses being struck in the stomach and groin. The racing industry denies that jockeys' whips are harming horses. The report's author says the study is a world first. This special report by John Stewart.
Horse racing is fast and furious, but this vision, filmed by a special high-speed camera, allows the race to be slowed down, showing the exact moment when the jockey's whip strikes the horse.
Well, this is really unique footage because we're seeing the impact at 200 frames per second, so we can really analyse very carefully how the whip makes impact with the horse.
The RSPCA obtained footage of 15 races at the Gosford track north of Sydney over 2 days in June last year. The footage was then examined by Professor Paul McGreevy, a veterinary scientist from Sydney University and a scientific advisor to the RSPCA.
And we can find out what part of the horse is struck, we can find out what part of the whip is making contact, we can see how the whip is being held, and we've been able to report these impacts from over 100 whip strikes.
At the meetings filmed by the RSPCA at Gosford last June, the stewards noted just one infraction of the whip rules. But Professor McGreevy's study found 28 breaches, half of them when the jockey's whip arm rose too high above the shoulder, and on 13 occasions when the whip hit the horse's head.
We did see evidence of the whip making contact with the horse's head. Whether that was intentional is another matter.
The Australian racing industry has also signed on to international guidelines to prevent horses from being whipped on the sensitive flank or abdomen. Instead, jockeys are only meant to strike the horse on the hindquarters or the shoulder. But the slow-motion footage shows this guideline is not being enforced.
So we've got the saddle here, and we've been looking at impacts behind the saddle. Everything between the end of the rib cage and the start of the hips is called the flank or the abdomen, and it's sensitive skin. The whole of the horse's skin is sensitive. They feel a fly landing on them. So we'd be very surprised if this was not accompanied by pain.
Paul McGreevy's analysis of the footage found that 75% of whip strikes hit the horse on the abdomen or flank, rather than the fleshier hindquarters. On some occasions, horses are struck in the groin. The study also found the whip makes clear indentations on the horse's skin more than 80% of the time.
We're seeing here evidence of the horse's skin being deformed by the impact of the whip. So I'd be most surprised if that doesn't come with some pain.
The RSPCA provided the footage to racing authorities. They say that any skin marking is only temporary.
Our stewards and veterinarians, of course, have professional ethical responsibilities, examine the horses immediately post-race, and they examine them to determine whether there are any markings and to see whether the horses are sound in every other respect. If there are any markings, they're reported, and the evidence clearly is that the horses are not being marked in the fashion that's being suggested by the RSPCA.
The Australian Racing Board says there is no good scientific evidence to prove whether or not a jockey's whip causes a horse pain. The RSPCA disagrees.
To suggest that being hit when a visible indentation is being made, that's how hard these horses are being hit with whips. To suggest that that doesn't cause pain is ridiculous, and if it didn't, why would jockeys use whips in the first place?
If this wasn't taking place on a racecourse, it would be a prosecutable offence. It would be an act of cruelty.
Our rules are extremely prescriptive, and they've been designed with the welfare of the horse as the paramount consideration.
Professor McGreevy's study also raised questions about the rules governing how many times a horse can be hit. The more powerful forehand whip contact is subject to restrictions. Jockeys can only use the forehand whip 5 times during a race, before the final 100 metres. However, the study found that the jockeys relied heavily on the alternative and less powerful backhand whip, which is unrestricted throughout the race.
Certainly the forehand is the focus of the rules, so this finding is troubling because it suggests that the rules that are there to safeguard horse welfare do not apply in the majority of cases of whip striking.
In Australia, jockeys have used a padded whip since 2009 to reduce the impact on the horse. But Professor McGreevy found that horses were struck frequently with the unpadded section of the whip more than half the time.
Well, we found that 64% of the time the unpadded section of the whip was making impact with the horse. And that's very troubling because if the padded whip is supposed to safeguard horses from pain, then it's failing in its job.
Any evidence at all that a particular action is inappropriate in terms of being contraindicated in terms of the welfare of horses, then we frown on that and we do more than that. The stewards penalise it.
The RSPCA wants Australia to follow the example set by Norway, where whips were banned from horse racing in 1982.
Well, the RSPCA would like to see whip-free racing in Australia. There is no need to whip horses. They will still win races if they're not whipped. If you remove whips from racing, you will take away this welfare problem, but it won't actually affect race outcomes.
But racing authorities say that Norway is not a practical comparison.
They don't have thoroughbred racing on the scale that you would recognise as being meaningful. We might as well talk about what the practices are in Timbuktu. We believe, and we do this on sound grounds, that the whip does have a place for safety, for control and for communication, but it has to be used within tightly regulated confines, and we have those in place.
The RSPCA says that jockeys should still be allowed to carry whips for safety, but should not be allowed to use them just to make horses run faster. John Stewart, Lateline.
The Australian Jockeys Association declined to be interviewed for that story, but released a statement to Lateline saying that the AJA does not condone incorrect, unnecessary or excessive use of whips in racing. That statement in full will be posted on our website.